Now that I look back and look at those pictures from childhood, we didn't look alike at all. We don't have the same coloring. We don't have the same face shape. I mean, nothing alike.
Hello, you are listening to NPE Stories. This is a podcast where NPEs can share their story. I am your host, Lily, and I found out I was an NPE through an ancestry DNA test that changed my life forever. NPE is a term that stands for Not Parent Expected or Non-Paternal Event. This means that one or more of our parents are not who we believe them to be. NPE Stories is a podcast where NPEs can share their story of what their original family was like, how they found out they were an NPE, and what their journey has been like since the day they found out. Welcome to episode 224. And if you are listening to this podcast, please leave a comment or leave a rating or review. Be honest about it. We have people come on and it can be incredibly stressful to share their story. And so I'm so grateful for all my guests that come on. They are so brave. This helps our community so much. Thank you so much for everyone that has ever been on this podcast. And today I'm speaking with an NPE. Today I have on Lisa F. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Lily. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I have no complaints.
Well, thank you so much for setting time aside and doing this with me a little earlier than we thought. So thank you for being so flexible.
No problem.
Okay, Miss Lisa, let's get into your story. So how this goes is we normally start with getting a little bit of your background.
Mm-hmm.
That would be your family of origin and your raising family and what that was like.
Okay. So I am from Oklahoma, and my parents were married. My parents, as I knew them, they met in our small hometown and dated for a few years. They got married on April 30th, 1965, which will be significant. I had one brother growing up. He's 4 years younger than me. And we had like the Leave It to Beaver family. That's what my friends called it because my parents both worked. We had dinner at the dinner table every night. My mom cooked, or my dad did, whichever one got home first. And we played sports growing up. My dad rodeoed, so we went to rodeos. We had normal family vacations, sometimes more than other years. But I mean, we didn't grow up in a rich family, but we weren't poor by any means. We never had a lack of food or anything. But my parents both worked at a company that was in our hometown, and we had a good life growing up. They always got along. I never saw them argue or fuss. There was never any stress in our house, really. And so I would say that I had the perfect childhood. As I was growing up, my parents, you know how they talk about the village. So my parents had a wonderful village. We had families that we went on vacations with. My mom had a best friend growing up. And so I spent time at her house, or we spent time with my dad's friends. And they just had a really good friend group growing up. And they were like our uncles and aunts. We went on vacations together. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better childhood. My parents didn't come from big families. Well, they came from big families, but they weren't close to their families because my dad had a sister and she passed away before I was born. She had two daughters, but they lived with their dad. And then my mother had a brother, my Uncle Jimmy, and he didn't have any children. He was kind of like a rolling stone. So, like, we would take vacations to see my grandparents. At one time, before my grandmother on my dad's side died, she lived behind us in a trailer house behind our house. And then because my grandparents on that side were divorced. And so we always had family around us, but we didn't have our cousins. So the village that we grew up in with their friends and their kids was like our cousins, I would say, because we all grew up together.
You were really close with these friends of the family.
Yes, very, very.
Now, Lisa, did you have any signs when you were a kid that you were an NPE?
I didn't have any signs, I would say. I never dreamed that I was an NPE. But I will say, if I had been smart in high school, I would have known that I was not my dad's child because my dad has blue eyes, my mom has brown eyes, and I have green. And so biologically it's not, there's no way. And my brother had blue eyes. And so growing up I used to always think, wonder why I didn't get the blue eyes. If I had blue eyes, boy, I can't even tell you what I would look like, because I always thought blue eyes were so pretty. I mean, now that I'm older, I appreciate my green eyes. But back then, I wondered why I didn't have the blue eyes like my dad. But I never questioned it because I did look like him. I did have dark hair. My mom had dark hair. My dad, he had brown hair or sandy blonde. And so I just felt like I was a mixture of the two of them. But I never questioned my eyes. So when my parents were married on April 30th, 1965, I was born on April 29th, 1970. And so I had friends, my mother was 27 when she had me. My dad was 31. Well, my best friend in high school, her parents were 10 years younger than my parents. And so they had to get married, because they got pregnant in high school. So I used to always joke to my friends and say, oh, yeah, my parents got married the day after I was born once my dad saw that I was his. And so I would joke about that. And so it was cute and it was funny until it wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
My dad had a friend named Phil, and he was around. He was an alcoholic, and I remember him because my dad and him took me to the liquor store one time, and they let me get up on the counter. That was back when, the liquor stores, you walk in and there was a counter at the front, and then all the liquor was behind it. And so I can remember being a toddler. I don't even know how I remember this, but I do remember being on the counter and them letting me go pick a bottle. And my dad's friend, he also dated one of my mother's best friends. And so I have memories of them. I have memory every Christmas, every birthday, he would bring me a silver dollar. And that was just his thing. He didn't ever bring a card. He didn't ever bring a gift, but he would bring a silver dollar. And I still have the silver dollars to this day. There's 13 of them. And he passed away when I was 8. And so I don't know what all events he gave them to me, but I do remember him always giving me those silver dollars. And so, growing up, I kept them, even though I was in the military for 20 years and I moved around a lot. For some reason, I kept those silver dollars. And so that is significant also. I'll say that.
Yeah. Lisa, how did you find out you were an NPE?
So I always questioned my heritage because we're from Oklahoma and my grandmother was born on Indian territory. And so growing up, there was always that stigma that there was a rumor that we were Native American, but then our family always claimed Black Dutch, and they never could tell us really where we came from. And so a cousin and I, back in about 2015, we both said we wanted to do a DNA test so we could kind of put everybody in their place and show them that we were Native American. And so I had wanted to do one, and then I found out that it was stronger in the men. So I wanted my dad to do one, and I wanted my uncle, my mom's brother, to do one. And I thought that would give us more information on our heritage. Well, I kept putting it off, And in 2019, my uncle had a heart attack and passed away. And so I didn't get to do one with him. And then in 2020, my dad passed away. He had had some strokes. And so he was sick for a while. And so I never got to do the DNA test with them. So in 2022, during Prime Week, of course, I saw that they were on sale. And so I decided to get one and take one. And it sat on my desk for a couple of months. And finally, I took it. And then I got the results on November 1st. And boy, was I shocked. I had 0% Native American and nobody from my dad's side of the family was on there. So to say that I was shocked was an understatement. And what I will add is that in 2018, my dad went through a divorce. And when he went through the divorce, he was missing his ex-wife. And I was trying to get him to see, because my dad and I had a wonderful relationship. We were so close. Now, my mom, she had passed away in 1994. She had cancer. So she had been gone a long time. But my dad and I have always been close. He's always been like, I mean, more than a dad, but, just our relationship is like none other. My brother and him don't even have the same relationship. We can tell each other anything. And so in 2018, when he was going through his divorce, he was missing his wife. And I asked him, so what do you miss about her, Dad? Because y'all had a horrible marriage. Like, she was horrible. But you and Mom had a great marriage. And he said, well, Lisa, our marriage wasn't always as good as you thought it was. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, your mom had an affair. Mm. And I kind of laughed. I said, seriously, Dad? Like, no, Mom would never cheat on you, And he said, well, she did. And I said, with who? And he said, with Phil.
Oh.
And I said, Dad, he was an alcoholic. Mom did not want him. And he said, well, whatever it was, I know they had an affair. And I said, well, my first question was, well, is Lee his? That's my brother. And he said, oh, no, because in my head, I thought, if he knew there was an affair, why would he still be friends with him? And my brother was born in 1974. And so I didn't think that they would still be friends if it was me, if it was back during my time. Yeah. And I didn't know how far back their friendship went. And so he said, oh, no, he's not Lee's, Lee's not his. And I said, well, Dad, if you're so sure they had an affair, why did you stay with Mom? And he said, well, because I loved her and I loved you kids and I didn't want anybody else raising my kids. And I said, okay, well, you gave us a great life together. And so even if they did have an affair, it didn't affect y'all's marriage because y'all did, y'all did well for yourselves. You raised us to do well. We've both been successful. And so think about the good and stop thinking about the bad. And he never mentioned it again. And so when he told me that, when he would tell me significant things like that, I would tell my brother. My brother, he would always say, well, Dad doesn't talk to me like that, And so when I told him that, he said, that's interesting. But we didn't really discuss it further. And so when I got my DNA results, I was actually on the phone with my brother. And when I did the ancestry, I didn't even think about DNA matches. That was the least of my thoughts. I was looking for our heritage. And so when it came in, the DNA matches, I didn't recognize the top two. And so I'm on the phone with my brother, searching Facebook for the top name or the second to the top name. So the top name, it was only initials and it said aunt. And then the second name, it said first cousin. And that person managed the aunt's DNA. And so I Googled the name and it came up. And then it said her closest relative was the person's initials that were on there. And when I clicked on her name, it showed me like who her maiden name was. And I said, oh my gosh, Lee, that's Phil's sister. That means Phil is my biological father.
Oh.
And my brother said, well, I guess Daddy wasn't as crazy as we thought he was. And of course, he said what everybody says. Well, Lisa, that doesn't mean that Dad's not your dad. Dad is still your dad. And I said, I understand that. I know this doesn't have anything to do with Daddy. This has to do with Mom. I have my oldest son. I got pregnant when I was stationed overseas, and I ended up marrying his dad. And when I married his dad, my mom questioned me. She said, are you sure that's even his? And I said, of course I know it's his. We're in a relationship. But she questioned it. And it really hurt me that she would question me like that. And so when I told my brother, because I had never told him what Mom said to me, he was young. It was when I was like 21 years old. So he was 17 or 16. And so he never knew what Mom said to me. And Daddy didn't either until after she passed. I told him. And he said, well, Lisa, she was sick, because she did have cancer for a long time. And we didn't know how long she had had it. And so when I told my brother that, he said, okay, he understood why I told him, this is about Mom. This isn't about Daddy. This isn't about me and you. Because he said, you better not ever call me your half brother. And I would never, because he's my brother and my dad is my dad.
How were you feeling when you are piecing this together, finding out the aunt is Phil's sister?
It was really, I wanted answers. I wanted to know everything. I wanted to know if she knew. I wanted to know if my mom knew, if Phil knew. I wanted to know if everybody knew. And it was just me that didn't know, or even if my dad had known, because at that point I wondered, so did Daddy know this the whole time? Which he didn't treat me like he knew it, but I don't know. And that's one thing that I'll never know. Now, it brought me closer to my family. Having an aunt now has been amazing. I never had that growing up, and she has welcomed me with open arms. It took a little bit, a couple of months, but everything turned out wonderful. So
you are in touch with your aunt, with Phil's sister.
yes, and she is a Spitfire. So initially, I did not contact her. I contacted my cousin, her daughter, because when I found out, she was 87, 86 or 87 years old. And so I didn't know how her health was. I wasn't sure if she would even want to meet me.
Yeah.
And it's not really meeting because we grew up in a small town. And so once I told my cousin who I was, I called her the next day, which my brother was like, Lisa, hold on, just give it a couple of weeks and think about it. Well, by the time he sent that text, I had already called her because she owns a business. She's in our hometown. And so her phone number was out everywhere. So I called her. And when I called her, I said, hi, my name is Lisa. And I just found out because, I got the notification from Ancestry. And so I figured she would get the same notification. And so I thought she probably had already seen it, but she had not. So when I called her, I said, hey, I got this notification on Ancestry, and I'm pretty sure that Phil is my biological father. And she said, who is this? She was shocked. And she was in the grocery store. So when I told her who I was, she said, and who is your parents? And I told her, and she said, oh, I remember them. I remember them well. You had great parents. And I said, yes, I did. And I made it very clear. I said, I am not looking for anything. I'm not asking for anything. I have my family. I do well financially. So I wasn't looking for anything, but this is what came up. And I wanted to make sure you knew before you went to any of my family, because most of our mutual friends on Facebook were my cousins on my mom's side. And so I wanted to make sure that she didn't go to them yet and let this out, because at first, when I first found out, I was pretty tight-lipped about it. And I didn't want my mom's business out there, because she's not here to defend herself,
Yeah.
and I didn't want to stain her reputation. But I will say that she was 27 years old, I mean, I did a lot of stuff in my 20s that I'd probably regret too, not a child out of, wedlock, but still, you know, or an affair baby, I should say. So yeah, we talked. She said, I'm going to ask my mom, and I said, okay. And the next day she called me, or I called her back, and I said, I forgot to ask you something. I need to know about our medical history, because my dad was diabetic, my grandmother was diabetic, both my cousins are diabetic, and I've been getting screened for diabetes my whole life. And now I know that I'm not even blood to them.
Oh, yeah.
And so she told me, she said, no, we don't have anything in our family really except addiction. And she said, Phil was an alcoholic. His dad was an alcoholic. We've got a few cousins that, dealt with substance abuse. And I mean, we'd found out recently that there's other things in the family that is hereditary. The first time I met my aunt, we found out, she showed me a picture of her, and she said, that's before I had eye surgery. And my son has lazy eye in his left eye, and she had it. And then my cousin, her grandson has it. So there's other things, but the main thing in their family is addiction.
Did Phil pass away from alcoholism or complications due to that?
Yes, he did.
Mm-hmm.
He did. He was 40 years old, 39 or 40 when he passed away. He was young. And my aunt found him. And he had gotten married in 1974. And so I remember going to his wife and his house and staying there. I have memories. And actually his widow, she had been contacting me on Facebook since 2018. And she's older also. So I think she would forget her password or whatever. And then all of a sudden a new Facebook profile would contact me, and it would be her. She knew all along that I was his. I finally got the nerve to ask her about a year and a half ago. Well, it's been almost 2 years, because it was October. And I finally asked her if she knew. And she said, yeah, I always knew. And I never had a problem with your mother, because it was over with before me and him got together.
So Phil knew, and Phil's okay, and his widow knew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I asked her, I said, well, how did he know that I was his? Or how did you know that I was his? And she said, because he told me. And I said, well, how did he know that I was his? And she said, because your mom told him. And I said, well, did my dad know? And she said, no. And she said, Phil would get drunk at night and cry because he wanted to have a relationship with you, but he couldn't because he was so afraid that your dad would kill him. And my dad, they were still friends. I mean, I found his obituary in my mom's Bible, and the first pallbearer to be listed was my dad.
Wow.
Yeah. And there's different things that I've found over the years. I haven't found anything directly from my mom, but there's things with his name on it. But it was just like anybody else's name. It was so insignificant, through the eyes of my mom. So she left no trail. Now, I will say that my aunt, once we finally talked, she said, Phil told me one time, but she said, I really wasn't paying attention to him. She said, he called me late at night. He was drunk and said that you were his. And I just kind of blew him off because he was drunk. And so he told a lot of people. When I met my cousin's dad, because her mom and dad, my aunt and him have been divorced for about 50 years. And so when I met him, he said, "Oh, yeah, Phil told me you were his." And even my aunt, she said, "He did? When did he tell you?" And he said, "Well, because Phil owned a dairy farm." And he said, "Well, we would be out on the farm. I'd help him out on the weekends. And one time he told me that you were his."
Phil must have thought about you a lot to mention this to so many people.
Oh, yeah, I think so. And even the silver dollars,
Yep.
when I first got the friend request from his widow in 2018, she messaged me and she said, "Oh my gosh, she's Mexican and her English is not very, she's been here forever, but her English is still very broken." And she messaged me and she said, "Oh, Lisa, you look just like your mother." And I said, "Oh, thank you," because I get that all the time. And I said, "I still have all the silver dollars that Phil gave me." And she really didn't say anything about that. And so when I finally asked her if she knew that I was his, she said, "So how old were you when your mom told you?" And I said, "My mom never told me." And she said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe she never told you that." And I said, "Well, I mean, I feel like once he passed away when I was 8 years old, she was kind of out of off the hook because there was no way that it would ever come out."
Did Phil have any other children that you know of?
No, no, no other children. I keep looking, thinking I'll match with somebody, but
Yeah.
no, no other children. Mm-mm. Now, within about a month after, I uploaded mine and my cousin's DNA into my heritage, and we matched with somebody else, another aunt. And so there's another story within the story.
Yeah. How does that happen? Another aunt.
Yes. So, just like Phil was the life of the party, so was his dad.
Oh.
And he was also an alcoholic. And so my aunt, she said, she had told my cousin, she said, "Well, I probably got siblings out there because, just like Phil was the life of the party and an alcoholic, so was my dad." And so when we found the new one, she was all excited, but that's not my story to tell. We have met her and we have a good relationship with her now, but we didn't at first. I mean, she wasn't rude or anything. She was just not ready to pursue it. But it's been, almost 3 years now. And so about a year ago, she contacted me and said, "Okay, I'm ready to meet everybody." And so I met her in December, and then my aunt met her this last January. And so it's been really good.
And I know you say that's not your story to tell, but just out of curiosity, did she know she was an NPE? I'm assuming she was an NPE.
Well, she did. Her and her sister had found out like 2 years before when they did the DNA test and found out they were half siblings.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but she never knew the family like I do.
Yeah.
So, growing up, I always knew the family. I remember Phil's mother. I did not know until my cousin told me that when I was born, my parents were renting this little 2-bedroom, 1-bath house, and it was owned by Phil's mother. And that's another,
Yeah.
aha moment that we've had. We've had a few, come to find out my cousin had babysat me when I was a baby. And it was when we found out that we lived in that house that she owned. She said, "I think I babysat you." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "Well, I remember going to Grandma Ricky's house when I was barely old enough to babysit and babysitting a baby girl. And it had to have been you because I was only 12 or 13 years old and she's 12 years older than me." And so she had babysat me when I was a kid. And then there's other times that we've had, certain things jog your memory. And so she can remember being on a boat. She said Uncle Phil had a boat, and I can remember being on there with my mom and dad and you and your mom and dad and Gail, which was my mom's best friend, and her daughter, and we were all on this boat out in the lake riding in the boat. And so we all have these memories.
I know you were talking earlier about, you didn't you didn't want anything to stain your mother's reputation, and you were being quiet about this at one point.
Mm-hmm.
Does your family you're raised with, like cousins, or I suppose even your children, do they now know that Phil is your dad, or are you still kind of keeping that
No,
quiet?
everybody knows. I am an open book now.
Yeah.
I feel like I've been a secret my whole life, and I don't want to be a secret anymore. And it hasn't stained my mom's memory. Like I tell people, she was 27. I mean, to be honest, Lily, I don't even know that my dad could have kids. I don't know if my brother's his. And we'll never know. He doesn't want to do a DNA test. He doesn't have any children, so he won't have any children doing a DNA test to find out. And it's okay, because I know that we don't have the same biological father. Now that I look back and look at those pictures from childhood, we didn't look alike at all. We don't have the same coloring. We don't have the same face shape. I mean, nothing alike. Now that we're older, we both look like our mother, because my mother premature grade and we both did. And we just both look like her now. But looking back, I mean, Phil was redheaded with green eyes. My cousin's redheaded with green eyes. My aunt is. And the first time I met my cousin, she asked me, she said, "What color eyes does Lee have?" And I said, "He has blue eyes just like Daddy." And she said, "And you have green eyes just like me." And so, looking back, should have been signs, I think. But of course, my mother knew. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know if my dad could even have kids. My dad grew up training horses, and my parents had been married 5 years when I was born, so it wasn't for a lack of trying. My dad had been married previously to a lady, and she never got pregnant until they had been divorced for about a year, and she got pregnant. So I kind of think my mom maybe was just doing what she had to do to have a child. I don't know, and I won't ever.
And your parents continued to stay married until your mother passed in 94?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. They had been married, well, they were about to be married 30 years, but they had been together for 33 years.
Oh, wow.
And they would be together today if they were both alive. I mean, my dad loved her like no other, you know. That
Yeah.
was his true love. And my mom was crazy about him. Like all of her cousins that I've spoken to that she grew up with, because she had a lot of first cousins, even though I didn't have any, but she has a lot of first cousins, and they all have said, "Oh, there's no way she would cheat on your dad." And I said, "Well, DNA doesn't lie, moms do, but not DNA."
Mm-hmm.
and they just find it really hard to believe. And so I ran into two of the couples that I grew up with that mom and dad used to go out with all the time. I ran into them in a restaurant about a year ago. And it was the first time I had seen them since my DNA discovery. And they just happened to be together, which was good. And so I told them about it, and they all remembered Phil. And one of the men, he said, he was telling me, "Oh, he was such a great guy. He was a good person. He just had an alcohol problem." And he said, "I think if Phil had lived, it all would have came out." And so I just believe that everything happens for a reason. I found out when I was supposed to, because if I had done those DNA tests before my dad passed away, it would have broke his heart.
Yeah.
If he didn't know. So I think it happened when it was supposed to.
Now, how are you doing these days emotionally? How has that process been for you?
It's been up and down. Some days it's wonderful. And every once in a while, I'll have a breakdown. I can be riding in the car, and all of a sudden, I'll just start crying out of nowhere. But on a daily basis, I'm good. I mean, me and my husband, we talk about it. Not all the time, but when I do feel like it, I talk about it to my husband, and I tell him, about just certain things growing up, and how now it makes me think back and think, okay, how was it really, when I first got my DNA discovery, and I know this is jumping back, the first person I called after I got off the phone with my brother was my mom's best friend, Gail. And I asked her if, I called her and I said, Gail, I did a DNA test. And I was crying, of course, because it was the first day. And I said, and it showed that Phil is my biological father. And she just started crying. And she was like, I'm so sorry, Lisa. And I said, so you knew? And she said, no, I didn't know. She said, but I knew that there was something happening with them, but I didn't know how far it had gone. She said, Lisa, their chemistry was great. She said, we would go out dancing. Your dad would be on night shift. We would go out dancing, and they would end up dancing the whole night and leave me sitting over there looking like the third wheel. And she said, they just, you could tell they had a love between them. They had good chemistry. They always had a good time. And she said, your mom was so outgoing. He was so outgoing. And together, you could just see the attraction between them. And I mean, I look back, I've seen cards from them, from her and Phil, and dated like 1969. And that was when they were together. But that was also when my mom and him were together. And so I don't know. I don't know if they were in love. I don't know if it was just, a sexual thing. I don't have a clue. But I know that it wasn't like a one night stand. I know that went on for a while. One of his cousins told me, he said, oh, yeah, I remember your mom. I remember her little car was always out at the farm. And so they were pretty bold, Of course, it was before cell phones and tracking and, Life 360 or any of that. So they could do that.
That is so challenging when all of the parents are deceased, and including your birth father, but it sounds like you've still managed with the cousin and the aunt and your mom's best friend to get some information.
Yes. Yes, I have. And, I mean, they all have different perspectives. One of my mom's friends passed away a couple of weeks ago. And back in April, she had put something on, I had posted something on Facebook, and she put on there about, I think it was probably my daughter, because everybody thinks that my daughter looks just like my mom, because my mom had really dark features. She had jet black hair, dark brown eyes, big dimples. And my daughter is too. My daughter is biracial, but she looks so much like my mother. It's not even funny. She looks more like her than I do. And so everybody is always commenting when I post a picture of her about, oh my gosh, I see your mother, And so this lady, she commented and she said, oh, your mom was such a good friend to me. We had so many good conversations. And so I messaged her and I asked her, I said, I would love for you to share with me the conversations that you and mom had. And she said, oh, yeah. She said, a week before she passed away, I went and saw her in the hospital. And she was telling me, just spilling her heart. And I said, really? So did she tell you that daddy wasn't my biological father? And she said, yes, she did.
Wow.
And that's the first person that I've talked to that actually knew that, except for Phil, that mom had told. But she kind of said, oh yeah, your dad was so good to marry her after, knowing that you weren't his. And I said, well, daddy didn't know that I wasn't his. I mean, they had been married 5 years when I was born. So it wasn't that she was pregnant when they met, and I don't know if she thought she was covering for mom or if she just didn't get the full story from mom, but that's what she thought. And we never got to sit down and have a proper conversation about it because she passed away tragically. So
yeah,
it's something that I'll never know, but I do know that mom shared it with her.
Have you found anything to be helpful since finding out you were an NPE? Anything feeling comforting sounds like you have your husband as a
Mm-hmm.
support system. Have you found like a support system or reading
Well,
books online?
I have read books. I have listened to all of your podcasts and a few
Oh,
other from other podcasters. And it made me realize that it's nothing, like, Lisa, you're not special. This isn't just something isolated to you. It happens all the time. It happens every day. And so that comforted me to know that I mean, it's not that big of a deal. It didn't really change anything about my family. It added to it with my aunt and my cousin. And, my brother, he's not as understanding, but I think now he's starting to understand better because I had a talk with him a few months ago and I told him, I said, listen, I know you're uncomfortable when I talk about them, but they're my family. I said, I don't feel any closer to Phil knowing that he was my biological father because he's gone and daddy was my dad. But she is my aunt and my cousin is my cousin. And I said, I get a text or a call from them every single day. There's not too many days that go by that I don't hear from them, either by talk or text. And I said, so they are my cousin. They are, she is my aunt. And I said, that hasn't changed. I said, I have just as good of a relationship with them now as I do with you. And he
wow.
said, well, that's good. I didn't realize that y'all were so close. And I said, yeah, we're very close. I mean, when we go out to eat, it's okay, Lisa, what are we eating? Because we have the same palate.
Mm-hmm.
We're so much alike. It's like I finally found where I belong. Things that I've been trying to suppress my whole life. Like, Lisa, you can't be different like that. You have to like the farmhouse decor. Well, I'm not a farmhouse kind of girl. I like a little bit of everything. And when I went to my aunt and my cousin's houses, their house was like a big mishmash of everything. And I'm like, okay, that's where I get it from because I'm not the norm. I'm not a cookie cutter or whatever. I don't like everything matchy. I like just everything. Whatever I like it. And whether it goes together or not, that's what I like. And that's the same way they are.
I love that you had this conversation with your brother. I think so many of us as NPEs are kind of just not allowed to discuss our new family members, with our
Right.
raising siblings. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
this is now my family. I get what you were saying.
Yeah. It's hard. It's hard for him to understand. He's real quiet about it. And he's told his wife, like, I don't know, dad might not be my biological father, but I don't want to know. And I understand
Yeah.
that too. It has been life changing. It's bittersweet. That's what I'll say.
Yeah. If anyone wants to get in touch with Lisa, email npestories@gmail.com and reference episode 224, Lisa F's story. I will forward along any messages to Lisa. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing where you're at. I really appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate you too. And I appreciate everything that you've done for this community, bringing awareness to people to just understand that it's a significant emotional event, but you don't have to be there alone.
These stories are here for us to identify with. If you are an NPE and would like to share your story, email npestories@gmail.com. You do not have to give any identifying information. If you are an NPE and would like to share your story, I'd like to hear from you. Subscribe to this podcast to hear more. Come heal with us.